the more I learn, the more I learn, the more I'm able to share with other people. And this was first presented publicly in 2019 at the General Assembly, and you can find it online. This was the Sophia Lyons Foz lecture for 2019. So if you want something to refer to, you can find that. We really are talking about making an identity shift because, you know, it's been in front of us all along, but we just couldn't even see it. That we think about church, we relate to church as a family. And so the shift is for us to reconceptualize, in a sense, church as a community of communities. And we'll say a little bit more about that. We've made these kinds of identity shifts before. When Bill Sinkford, and probably many times before, but when Bill Sinkford went into office, he was stressing the Unitarian Universalist Association as an association of congregations. And I talked to him about that. That was really to bring focus on the members that the association served. So you hear kind of a shift in that from the association being the center of everything to the congregations being the center. And the communities of communities is kind of a parallel shift that we are asking people to make. We also did the work around welcoming congregations, and although that work is never done, but it shifted our culture and our identity, really, in that we were bringing the interests and the accountability to the LGBTQ community. So no longer just kind of passing and covering on the sides, but coming clearly to the center, and everyone else learning how to be accountable for that inclusion. We made this shift too with beyond categorical thinking. Many of your congregations have probably done that. And that was kind of like our EEO statement about ministry, because it could be very easy to assume that the people who are best suited for ministry have the traditional identity, usually male, most often in UU circles, white male. And of course, we made that shift in terms of gender, but beyond categorical thinking was to get people to recognize that that ministers are their identity and suitability are not necessarily along those traditional lines, and we may have that built-in bias without even realizing it. So it was to have more inclusion of ministers who are people of color or who have LGBTQ identity, ministers with disabilities. And so welcoming congregation was to do that, build in more equality there. Another program that helped to shift our identity was OWL, Our Whole Lives, right? Where actually we really had the examination of the traditional family structure and recognizing the limitations of traditional family in terms of inclusion. And so we are looking at, with OWL, you're talking about healthy sexual identity for our children, which is very important, but then also different expressions of families. And that is an identity shift as well. The last two that I want to touch on are the anti-racism training, Journey Toward Wholeness. That was a major shift. And many of the people who are in leadership in our association were engaged with and impacted by the Journey Toward Wholeness training. I still provide that training. I bring in trainers, but for 20 years now, you know, we've kept that training going. And the Black Lives Matter movement, you know, was another piece around identity, so that many of our congregations went through the kinds of discussions they needed to, in deciding about hanging Black Lives Matter banners. And so that was another systemic change. And now we're asking for congregations to make this shift in centering community of communities in terms of our identity. We already have the structure for this. And if you think about it, if any of you go to General Assembly, you see it, but you don't have to go there. You can open the UU World magazine or just think about it. We have our state advocacy networks. We've got UU Ministry for Earth. We've got all kinds of theological communities and Unitarian Universalism, humanist community, Jewish community, liberal Christians, just many of the theological groups and pluralism. All of these are communities. And in our congregations, we have the communities as well. Oh, I should go back in terms of these communities. We've got the ministers associations, all of the professional associations, and more and more and more. In our congregations, the community structure is already there. You've got your music community, and you saw some of that today. We have our religious education community, which includes not just children and youth, but the families and the people who are teaching religious education. We've got governance communities, social justice communities. Some people come to our churches for mindfulness community or book groups or quilting, on and on. But the communities are already in the church. Many of our churches have 7 principal communities. My church has 8th principal community, and that's a growing one as well. So these communities are already in the church, but you know what? We call them committees, but they usually are much more than that. And a lot of faith formation is taking place in these communities, and we do a lot of ministering to each other. So it's really not a stretch for us to do this. When the association brought small group ministries and covenant groups into our programming, I think that we missed an opportunity. And they recognized that people needed a smaller group to feel connected. But I think the missed opportunity was in acknowledging how many of those small groups or communities already existed. And so it created, I think, a false dichotomy where the covenant groups could be seen as the spiritual work of the church, and the committees were treated as business or programs. But they're communities. All of these communities are already existing. They're the glue that hold the church together. They're usually where people connect when they come into the church. And they're the engine that fuel it and carry it from year to year and decade to decade. One of the things that is important in this process is owning one's location, right? And recognizing that your individual experience is not necessarily a universal experience. So there's some things that we experience universally and collectively, but individually not. And let me use my own just to explain or demonstrate what I mean. So I grew up young, I'm a woman of color. I grew up in All Souls Church in Washington, D.C. It's very diverse. While I was growing up, the church was probably, 60-40, white and African American mostly. That has changed over the years, but my experience growing up, I did not experience Unitarian Universalism as a white religion. And I hear so many people talk about it that way, or when we're doing, the critique. And I just say, when I hear that, it's problematic for me because my location, I never experienced Unitarian Universalism as a white religion. because I experienced it through my own body, my own lived experience through my church. So it's problematic for me when I hear that used as a blanket statement. And if we make this shift from community of communities, then we're also shifting. So I like to think about we Unitarian Universalists are a community of communities that are practicing being accountable to the beloved community. Not we're a white religion, but we're Unitarian Universalists practicing being accountable to the beloved community. That's an invitation. The other is not. And so knowing and owning our own location matters. It's a different location being a director of religious education. It's a different location than, being an administrator or being the minister or being on the board. And each of those locations is important, but just people need to know that their own way of seeing the church is not the universal way of seeing the church. And I think that we have to really get that in order to unravel this thing. Because I could very easily just take my experience from All Souls Church and project it and judge all the other churches by what my church does. That's counterproductive, right? So understanding our own location and owning it, and the community is where people locate themselves. It helps people to locate themselves. It's also important to know that these communities are fluid. It's not like you belong to one community and just that community. You might belong to a number of them. So we move in and out of communities. With this concept, I know it seems, in some ways, it seems like a no-brainer. But I know that we're actually pressing a new edge because when we started preparing for services, I'd spent hours trying to find songs or poems or readings or children's stories. There are very, very few things out there that talk about communities or communities within communities. Almost everything is about me or I, or about an interpersonal relationship, or about a family. We have not graduated to this level yet. And that's not to say that it doesn't exist. It already exists. Some organizations live that way, but we haven't gravitated towards it yet. And if you start to notice, and you probably will, as so many people have given me feedback, how often we refer to family, and especially when we're talking about church. It's just there. It's built in. It was there before any of us showed up. The question is, are we aware of it, and can we actively engage in a new design? So let me wrap this up with saying that I encourage you to learn more. I had an experience about 2 years ago with the UU Ministry for the Earth. I have an environmental background, by the way. But we had come together, about 27 of us, for a retreat. The board wanted to do their work differently, but they didn't quite know how. We brought a consultant in. There's work going on around the world referred to as sociocracy, like socio and democracy, sociocracy. And the consultant brought that in and worked with us. And we had 27 people. We were in 3 groups. So you would consider that a community. One group was the board, one group was a people of color group, and one group was a young adult group. And while we went through that weekend, it was literally transformative, because what happened was equality was built into the voices of these groups. Each of the groups has a shared location, a different kind of take or view on the work. But it was having these processes and recognizing, for me, who I've done work for about 30 years in team building and group facilitation, And when I saw the sociocracy work, which was very similar to a lot of things we had done, but it's available everywhere. So I knew it's like, we could actually reach a tipping point in our association because people could get training from any number of places, and then we could move. Everyone won't get on board, everyone won't do it at the same time, but we can start to move towards this community of communities because people could build the capacity for learning how to do the interactive work in these groups. Let me give you one example. I also used to be president of DRUM, Diverse and Revolutionary Unitarian Universalist Multicultural Ministries. It was first formed by ministers of color and then open to lay leaders. But one of the things I learned about in DRUM was accountability. So listen to this because it applies across the board. Often when we are putting a group together, we'll hand select, it's like, oh, we want this person, this person, this person, this person. And we put that committee or that group together. But DRUM said, no, accountability is not you deciding who represents us, but us deciding who we send as our representative. And so our church had gone through a serious conflict about 2 years ago. And we put together a transformation team. And I said, well, let's put this team together by identifying which groups we want represented, and then ask each of those groups to send us a representative for the team. So we put our group together that way, and it worked extremely well. We had someone from religious education, someone from adult spiritual development, from our Silver Souls group, which is a senior group, our Young Souls group, which is a young adult group, leadership development and nominations, and we have an 8th principal team. And we had a liaison from our board and then co-chairs. Our co-chaired the group. So think about that. Now that was a shift, right? That's a change in accountability. I would love to see a board put together that way, rather than what we go through in terms of building a slate, and you have to go around and find people who will run. Then we have the annual meetings and we vote, and not that there's anything wrong with this, but it's a pretty cumbersome process. And then we have Robert's Rules of Order, the whole works. But what if we put a board together by asking the key communities in our church to send us a representative? I would love to see that happen. It's so much quicker. But also, then each of those committees has a different stake in the governance of the church. So I'm going to put that out there as an example, and just to show you how one of many ways that the community of communities can be applied. You'll figure it out in your own setting, your own context. We have an online sociocracy training. I just went through it in January. It's a 6-week training, 6 sessions. You could actually sign up for it now. And if you want, put it in the chat and Sam can let me know. We'll send you the link. There are only 14 slots, only 12 slots left. And it's an excellent training. In fact, it's worth doing it just to see how an excellent online training can be done. But so that will give you some of the tools for starting to move in this direction. And let me close with just a story before we open this for dialogue. I had listened to a Veterans Day sermon that was delivered by Reverend Kalani Kasera. And he quoted something that Reverend David Pyle had written, and it was published in the Quest magazine. Both of them are ministers, UU ministers, and they are both military chaplains. So I want you to keep in mind what I said about owning one's location. The name of this is They Just Fade away. They just fade away. And David Pyle wrote, "We are called to redefine our movement in light of our commitment to radical hospitality. There are veterans who sit in our pews and rarely talk about their military service. We ought to empower their ministries with other veterans. Churches should find ways to reach out with our saving message of hope, listening without our own biases to war. Doing so will change us as a religious movement. Who would know better how to create peace?" End of quotation. And so I just want to give you that as a sense of the power of a community that exists, already resides in our pews, that we barely, if at all, recognize. So with that, let me engage your questions or hear your comments. And Sam is going to help facilitate this. Mind you, I've been on my phone recording with you all day, so I can't see the whole screen. Thank you. Sam, are you there?
Yes, I am. And I think people should be able to unmute themselves at this point. I don't think there's a block on that.
Okay.
Let's
Well,
see.
help me out because I can't see anyone except myself and the smoke.
Okay, I see Kristen in, well, no, who's, another thing to do is you can raise your hand. And if you're having trouble unmuting, I'll unmute you. And you raise your hand by going to the participants page, and it's right down on the bottom of the participants page. So let's see who's either.
54.
Okay, people are unmuting themselves. Great. So who would like to speak first?
Is there anyone there? Let me then open it by asking, so between the service and what I shared with you now, what is something that has stuck with you?
And Mike and Kay had their hand up.
Okay, great.
So two things were quite profound to me. One is your characterization about family and how that influences decision making, and I hadn't thought about that. The other is just now you talked about communities volunteering or electing representatives to a board, and that sends chills down my back because our church has just gone through we're on 5 or 6 years of big governance change to walk away from the 60s models of big business creating departments and divisions. And so we called them councils rather than departments or divisions. But representatives to the board came from RE, came from an adult program council, came from a social justice council. And I'll use a strong word, but it deteriorated into, they weren't representatives of a greater community, they were representatives of that community from which they came. So it created built-in conflict over resource allocation. So your use of the word community, to me, I translated incorrectly into something that we're walking away from.
Mm-hmm.
Does that make sense to you?
Oh, absolutely. And I understand that. And certainly it can happen. I think that learning to be in a community of communities will be a discipline that will develop over time. You know, if we were to, so right now, a lot of people are still thinking as individuals or even as their own community as an individual as opposed to the greater good, the collective. But I think that'll come over time. But there's another piece. As you learn some of the processes, the techniques from sociocracy, then the way that we do collaborative business decision making changes. And so I would say, you know, you all probably had a good idea in terms of a different structure, but maybe didn't yet have the tools for helping you to get there. So if we go into those structures the same way that we operated before, we may not actually create what it is that we intended. You get what I'm saying? That we have to kind of retool ourselves, re-educate ourselves to function in those settings. And leadership development, you know, how we train people moving in and out of leadership positions matters. So we need a little more of a support system to create the context, right, for a different kind of collaboration. Does that help?
Yes, and I would love to hear Reverend Lynn or Reverend Wendy comment on that, because they were called to our church in the middle of us making our governance change. So they are intimately familiar with the struggle and how difficult it is to change the culture with a different model. So we have a different model, but we're having to walk away from lots of old behavior.
Yeah, and before we go there,
very hard
I want
work.
to hear from you, Wendy. So actually right now, I'd like to see a board put together that way, but that is not the primary request. The community of communities, I actually see that right now kind of as a change in how we relate in the congregation. And in partnership or in tandem with whatever your governance structure is. So I'm not proposing that as the new governance structure. And you know, you can kind of design with whatever fits in your setting. But I think that we'll start to learn and develop the discipline when the congregation itself is functioning as a community of communities, and then governance and leadership is relating to the congregation from that perspective, rather than, you know, our congregations are kind of like groups of individuals, right? When the communities are already there, but they're not as centered as they could be.
Do you want to talk? Do you want to talk a little bit, Paul, about some of the technologies? Because I think how a group meets, like going around the circle a couple times, there's some methods there that are very different from how we normally do things by calling on people, and where the loudmouths speak most and the quiet people never say anything. I think there's a real change in how individuals participate as part of the whole. That's part of the sociocracy design.
Yes, and so first of all, and I thought it would be difficult for us to do virtually without more prep work, but the way that we select representatives using the sociocracy tools, so you're in a smaller circle, which would be your community. Each person nominates someone, and then you go around and you say who it is and why. And then people kind of start to change, you know, given what they're listening to. And you do a couple of rounds, and then everyone comes to consensus or consent around who represents them. But it's been a very transparent process, and you get the buy-in as you move. And so with sociocracy, many of the decisions are made that way. You can present proposals. They go to the group of people that needs to weigh in and address on it. You come to a group decision using these processes. Let me say, so for example, when we do town hall meetings, which is where we address a lot of our issues, right? So often what happens is people are one by one getting up at the mic, but the intention is to try to persuade everybody about why we're right about our position or our proposal. It's not really a good format. for reaching any kind of decisions, I worked with a church that was steep in conflict, steep. And some members had called a congregational meeting. And of course, you know, the intent was probably to convince people of why their position was so right. But instead, what we did was we brought people together and had them work in the community of communities kind of format so that everyone could speak, everyone could be heard rather than one by one at the mic. And eventually they came to, you know, they did their work and came to a decision without the church tearing apart. And that's just an example of a different way of working. We're not designed yet for us to really get the maximum benefit of this. Thanks. I see Michael's hand up.
Yes, hi, Paula. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. First of all, thanks for the sermon today. It was very inspiring. I wonder if you could speak a little. Yeah, I wonder if you could speak a little bit more about the concept of owning your location. Yeah, because it's been my experience that every congregation tends to think, well, I'm speaking very generally, that congregations tend to think that the way that they practice Unitarian Universalism is the way that Unitarian Universalism is supposed to be practiced. I've traveled around to enough different congregations to know that there is broad diversity in how people practice the theological aspects of Unitarian Universalism. I've been to certain congregations that are more Christian focused, for example, and some that are more humanist. But it seems to be location by location. You know, certain communities, there may not be much racial or ethnic diversity. Some may be more conservative. I wonder if you could speak a little bit more about that concept of owning your location and how that relates to cultural change within congregations themselves.
Yeah, so good question. I'm glad you asked about it. Let me first put it in a context that I think wherever we are in the country, people can get this. So many people come to Unitarian Universalism after having experience with another denomination. And often, so each of those people has a location in terms of their relationship and their understanding of religion, right? So if a person, some people come because they just have been turned off for one reason or another, from maybe they've been harmed by it or whatever it is. They may have been turned off by the religion that they were part of before. They have a location when they come in, and they may want no parts of what they had before, right? There are some people who come who maybe were totally secular before finding the church. I talked to a lot of people say, I just sat there my whole first day and cried in the service because I didn't know that there were places like this existed. These are people who are new to Unitarian Universalism. So they have a location as well. Very different perspective, right? Mm-hmm. And the location of the other person I described. Then there are like the three people we heard on the video, and myself and Sam. They're people who grew up Unitarian Universalism and have a different location in terms of our perspective and relationship with the church or with the movement. So that's part of what I want to say about location, because no one of these people I just described owns the truth about Unitarian Universalism. But you can talk about it like we do, right? And there's a lot of that, especially people who have come from other places who define Unitarian Universalism based on what they found or what they wanted. And it's just, it's true for you, but not for everyone. Part of the power of Unitarian Universalism. One is that we're open for questions. We don't have like the right way, but also we have to learn to translate, right? So once I did the anti-racism work in a multi-faith setting, because we were all there for a common purpose, I learned that I can go and sit in any religious service and get the message.
Mm.
And the service does not have to be designed to fit my theological frame, but the message is there. And that's part of the power of Unitarian Universalism. When we reach a certain level of emotional maturity around it, or spiritual maturity, where we don't have to push back because someone said God, or that there is a prayer done a certain way, or whatever the particulars are. But we understand the message, because pluralism is a given, right? And so that's kind of what I mean about location. And then where you are in the country, I used to think that I had a thing about our churches really striving toward multiculturalism. But then I realized that a small UU church with only white members in a very conservative county and a state, that may be the only place where the liberal community gets to come together. And those churches are maybe more important than some of the churches that, can draw on a wider, more diverse community. So that's another example of location. It's like, what does it take for them to even form and to sustain themselves being surrounded by a completely different mindset or culture? They have a valuable role in that community. So does that help to answer your question?
It does. Thank you very much. I appreciate that.
Sure, Michael.
We
I
have
really do. Let me say, I really do think it's a matter of our spiritual maturity to be open and to not have to push back when something does not fit, the way we understand the truth or the frame that we prefer. When we can just let it be and get the message or make the interconnections, that's a sign of our maturity.
we have a question I see in the chat about defining beloved community. And I know that's also come up in our congregation all very recently, talking about that and having some questions about what does beloved community mean in a Unitarian Universalist context.
Yeah. Because I think that we have been called to really struggle with our early socialization as individuals and as a church community. And we have worked at it, like we said, OWL and Welcoming Congregation and our anti-racism work, the work that happened during the women's movement earlier, that we have really been called to recognize our internal biases and to work beyond those so that we are doing the work of inclusion. I have arrived at a definition for beloved community, so I'll just give it to you because I think it's some of the forward thinking. I see a beloved community as a community of communities, first of all. Let me stop and say, I think that too often people assume the beloved community is the absence of conflict. Everything is good here. No, that's not enough. So I see the beloved community as a community of communities, meaning that each of these groups can have some integrity in their culture and the work that they do. A community of communities that are actively engaged in living what the eighth principle says, and that's the dismantling of oppressions, all of the oppressions. So And we will not build the beloved community if we don't deal with racism, because we could work on the other oppressions and white supremacy will still just like stay right where it is. So we've got to take on racism, but it's about dealing with the other oppressions too. Ageism, heterosexism, ableism, all of those things are things that, you know, we've been socialized into this social hierarchy, and people with privileged identities don't even have to know that they have those privileges, that the world is designed to work for those who can, for whom things are most accessible. And people who are marginalized, depending on what's going on in the world, can become more and more marginalized. Let me give you an example. We could have had universal health care a long, long time ago. Remember when Hillary Clinton was working toward it?
Yes.
But people who were in the professional sphere, who had adequate health care, didn't really get on board. We could have worked and pushed it over the line back then, but we didn't, because folks' needs were already taken care of. Then we did finally get it, and now look where we are right now. You know, what does it take? And in this pandemic, you know, we have an administration that wanted to eliminate the pre-existing clause in the healthcare bill. Well, who's most susceptible to the coronavirus but people with pre-existing conditions? It's crazy. And then also, I think that the devastation of this disease is greatest in some of the locations that did not take the affordable health care package. So they don't have the protection for their people. And that's just one example. You know, healthcare, we could have done it much earlier, but we weren't working collectively. So the beloved community is a community of communities that's actively working to eliminate that social hierarchy that so disadvantages some people only because other people are privileged without knowing it or hold on to it. That's how the decisions are being made. It's all policy. I'm done. Did that help? Hello?
I've been involved in interfaith communities and particularly environmental. We have in this area the CRIC, the climate, oh dear, it stands for, oh yeah, Capital Region Interfaith Creation Care Coalition. And I'm finding a community of people there too that are very much worth relating to and working with. And I didn't know if you had any particular comments on community in terms of outside of Unitarian Universalist circles.
Yeah, thank you, Anne Marie. I think that our community of communities actually becomes the bridge to outside communities, so back and forth. And I think that's how a lot of people do find their way to Unitarian Universalism. You know, they've seen people out in the world standing on UU values, and they learn about it that way. Or they've come to some event in the church and they start to learn about it that way. We are definitely connected to the outside community. So think about this. Social justice is so central to UU identity and to UU practice. And I actually think that the social justice is important because it's our response to, we don't have a theology of evil, but I think our social justice work is our lived theology of evil. It's our response. So I look at it as, I believe in the power of collective positive intention. But there's an opposite to that too, collective negative intention. And that has power. And, you know, that may be what some people refer to as evil. It fits it in my book. That's how I refer to it, as evil. Collective negative intention. Our social justice work is about us standing up to that, addressing that. And that's how often we're seen in the world and people discover Unitarian Universalism, because for one reason or another, it really mattered in their lives, right? During the civil rights period, my church was very, very involved. And I've talked with people over the years. So many people came to the church because the church was in the community, standing up on some of those issues, fighting against segregation, desegregating programs in the church. But when we get seen out in the world doing our thing, standing for our values, the others in the community, others in the community recognize us as partners, but then some people will, you know, find it's like, I've been you all along, but I didn't know a church like this existed, right? And I'm sure you all have heard those stories too.
Speak up.
Yep.
I'd like to speak. I have a question, and I'm wondering if coming to to find a consensus among the various communities within our say our local church is kind of like the homework that's necessary before we can actually make the real bridge to make even wider connections outside of in the community, the larger community. Is that a good shortcut way of thinking about what you said, or am I off?
Well, it could be. It's a chicken or egg question, right?
Okay.
You know, do we need the structure for community of communities? As I said, it's already there. You know, I want to hear people say, we are a community of communities. I think it's that simple. We are a community of communities, and then kind of treat ourselves internally that way. And so it's already there, and it will be bridges to the wider community. But in many ways, there are many churches that already have those bridges to the wider community. But I think what I hear you say is that we need to learn to practice it more
Right.
intentionally.
Yes.
And yes, but I don't want to say that has to come first.
Okay.
Now, what you might find is that people come to the church, and then when something goes wrong, they leave again, right? So we kind of have that door, that flow in and out. I know, I've been watching it. And sometimes that's happening because when things go wrong, people don't feel like there's a place where their voices can be heard. So we create that community of community structure.
Right.
And there's a place where their voices can be heard, but also where they get to listen to other people and recognize that their point of view, their location is not the only one or not the most important one. So when we are involved in the work of listening to each other, what happens is we start to calibrate ourselves to each other. But we've got to create spaces where if people's voices don't matter, then can this be a safe spiritual home for them? Not really. Yeah, so it's a chicken or egg question, but the thing is for us to be developing our practices simultaneously.
Okay.
Good
Thank
question.
you.
You're welcome.
Others out there who've got questions or comments?
This is Christine. I had a couple thoughts, questions. Based on what you said about beloved communities, helps me have a better understanding of how important it is that our leaders be representative of the communities of communities. So much more sense. And then I was also just thinking about that in terms of myself as one person. I am, as one person, am part of many different communities, and looking at myself in terms of like, okay, when I'm in this community, I'm this way, and I'm in this community, I'm in another way, and when I'm in another community, I'm in another way. And about like thinking about myself as being genuinely myself when I'm in each of those communities, as opposed to taking on the identity of that community, and how that could be an important way to make the bridge, because I consider like myself one of those people who, when I found Unitarian Universalism, I'm like, oh, that's who I am. I just never knew it existed. So that when I am in my different communities, that I make sure that I stay true to myself with regards to that, so that that allows the bridges to naturally happen. And then, so yeah, that's what I was thinking.
Yeah, thank you. I think I saw, did you see the name of the person who had their hand up saying?
This is Tom, and
Yeah.
with my wife Carol. Thank you for sharing all this, Paul. It's been really interesting, challenging to me. I know that I talk, and I think a lot of people in my congregation talk a lot about community and the importance of community and our faith community, but I never really looked at it quite the way you're describing it, as sort of a construct, sort of a tool. This idea of the communities within the communities is a little bit more of a concrete way to understand our environment and to move forward. I think it's going to take me a while yet to get my head around it completely, but it's challenging and it's really interesting, and I think potentially really useful. So I just want to say thank you.
You're welcome. You know, we could almost take like the flow chart of the church, turn each of those boxes into circles and put them in the center of a bigger circle, community of communities, right? Instead of the hierarchy that we always build, you know. And it's just because it's there. It's traditional institutional structure. Let me give you an example for everyone. You know, granted, our church has been at this for a long time, and we have a large church, so we can have a multi staff. But so we called our first minister of color in David Eaton was in, oh my goodness, 1969, right after Martin Luther King's assassination. And he served for 23 years. Well, the whole time he was there, we had multiracial ministry, right? He was African American. So we had a multiracial ministry team in place. And then we had another minister of color follow him. It was only 4 years. And also we had multiracial ministry teams. So we had big difficulty. And we went into search. That's when I stepped into all of this. And so we had our search committee and our board trained in anti-racism before we ever touched an application. And we went to the board and we negotiated a commitment from our board for a multiracial ministry team, because we knew we couldn't count on that always being in place. So the board committed, and we've kept that, right? We called Reverend Rob Hardees as the senior minister, and then we had to build our membership back up before we could call our associate minister. So we've had a couple of associate ministers. Now get this, so we had a big blow up again. And when it happens for us, it always has a racial, almost always a racial sensitivity because of our makeup, right? And we're still working on the tools. When it's real good, it's real good. But when we run into conflict, we don't always have the structure and the tools in place in time. So this time, in looking at everything that happened, the first time we lost about 50 African American ministers 20 years ago when we had our first breakout, blow up. Then this time, women and ministers of color, members who were people of color were heavily impacted. But we were doing some of the community of communities work and other things. So we didn't have the great big loss, we lost some. And so I went back to the board and said, 20 years ago, we asked you for commitment to a multiracial ministry team. Now we're asking you to build equality into those relationships. Why did it take us so long? We were using the traditional institutional structures. And since we had called Rob Hardy's first, he's openly gay, but he's a white male, that meant every person who came into the associate position, one was going to be a person of color because we were committed to the multiracial team, but the person of color was always going to be in a subordinate position. How do we build beloved community that way? And we were operating under policy governance, which really concentrates the authority in the senior minister. So we had built in a structure where the racial inequity was at the top. So what are we modeling? So we were asking for a commitment to a collaborative executive team where the ministers would have equal authority and not one answering to the other, but their job would be to collaborate with each other. So now we have a collaborative team. We have an executive director who is also on equal status as the two ministers are or will be. And that's an example. It took us 20 years to change the structure. But that's an example of what we're talking about, right? Because we don't always, when things are going well, we are not examining the institutional structure. We're putting our efforts into other areas. And that's an extreme example, but I think there are a number of other groups that are starting to move towards a collaborative leadership. And again, we don't necessarily have the models or the governance for it, but we understand that it really does fit with what we are talking about in terms of anti-oppression and beloved community. We're learning.
Yeah. Sam, did you see that Reverend Leonisa has her hand up?
No, I didn't. The whole hand thing does not show up on my participants, so I'm not sure why. I think there's two ways to raise your hand. There's the reactions, which is one way to raise your hand, but that doesn't. Yeah, there we go. There's the way to raise your hand. So go ahead, Leonisa.
Thanks. Yeah, I use this a lot with students. So I'm learning all the little tricks of the many ways to raise one's. I just wanted to mention, well, this is so fantastic. And Paula, because we've been talking to you for months, I've been just thinking about this so much, and I went out and got the many right and read it and started to talk about my with my COSM and the board. And one of the things I did, so one COSM member who does a lot of work in organizational development and org psych, and so she and I took a first pass and we made a document where we created what we thought the circles were, what our communities were, and then I sent it to the COSM, and then I sent it to the board, and then people gave feedback, and then we made it, and now it was a great exercise for me, and then all of us talked about it as we now created this document that looks like one of the diagrams from the sociocracy book of what the circles are, and the primary circle is the minister, the board, and I think we have the COSM as part of that, or right, and then we got crazy with arrows because we just started to really dork out about the whole thing, and what the communities are, and who fed whom, and where the more direct lines, and then and it was a really I had fun doing it, but that means there's something wrong with me probably. But it was a nice activity, and then now we're slowly kind kind of, I guess, slowly disseminating it to the congregation as a way of thinking about this, because after we spoke, I did do a sermon on the idea of communities and me to we, and there was a lot of positive feeling about that, especially as a new minister. I can come in and kind of have these conversations that are about change, that are generally uncomfortable, and they might give me a grain of salt because I'm new, but it wound up being a thing that most people were open to the idea, largely because I was presenting it as a way of saying, each of these groups has something to bring or share to the table. And if we keep making it like this committee's over here and this committee, and we don't have enough people for this committee, right? So the document was a helpful activity, I guess is what I'm trying to say. So.
Yeah, great. Well, people have more engagement. Yeah, it'll build our churches, and in the whole industry of church, one thing that they kind of discovered is that churches get stuck at various sizes. And if you change the governance structure, then you can break out of those ways of relating to each other that keep the culture the same, and the church can grow. And that's true. But I believe, and I want to stake on this, but we can't prove it yet. I believe that if we make this change, not in governance, not in the authority body, but if we make this change at the membership body, that our churches are going to grow. And I think it'll be at least parallel, if not a bigger factor in the ability to grow. So keep going, Leonisa, keep me posted. Because I really do think that more people are going to find entree to our churches. And when they come in, our churches are going to be more engaging and less conflict. And people will stick around. Thanks.
Love it.
Sam, you're ready too, right?
Well, like Schenectady, we also are doing this huge governance change thing too, parallel kind of thing. And there's a lot of great ideas in this, some of the governance change we're doing, because we're trying to look at unburdening the board from getting too much into details and having a different, like a second board or a subsidiary of the board that does some of the implementation. We're calling it ministry and operations team versus the board. But this, I think a lot of the methodology you're talking about, whatever your governance structure is, we can be going around the circle and asking for everybody's input twice. I think that just that one process is incredibly amazing. We've done that with some of our board meetings, and it's transformed, I think, our conversation, because I know I can be a dominator, and so it's easy in board meetings for one person to do all the talking, or even just 2 or 3 people, and they talk back and forth, and then there's 75% of the board is not at all participating. And when we go around, you realize everybody has something to say. Everybody's got things to contribute, and when we hear from everybody, we get to a much better solutions to our problems. So we can maintain, and then this could over time transition into a different governance structure, I think. But we don't have to wait to change anything in our governance structures to be able to use some of the sociocracy technology. A lot of it's really good, and I think it's so important. What you're highlighting is that when we've been trying to figure out how to do institutional change around institutional oppression, institutional systems of racism that are built into our structures, that's the part that feels so hard to change. And I think sociocracy is a big step in moving us into giving us a vision of how to be in a different way.
Yeah. So you're right. We don't have to wait for a change in governance structure to use the tools of sociocracy. We also don't have to wait for a change in governance structure to conceptualize our membership as a community of communities. So if you imagine both of those things moving together. And by the way, let's throw the 8th principle into the mix. You know, we adopted those principles 12 years before the association made a vote to become an anti-racist association. But we never went back and built that into the principles. If we had, I think we would have been moving differently. So where each of the principles implies it, but it's interpreted through the individual lens of each person. So this takes it out of the individual interpretation and builds it into the center of our theological mission, really, our covenant with each other. There are about 20 congregations that have adopted the eighth principle. So we're urging individual congregations out of congregational polity to adopt the eighth principle while we work to have it taken at the national level. Our board has been very supportive, interested. The National Association is already moving, staff-wise, is already moving very much in this direction rapidly. So we have about 20 congregations that have adopted it. We have a monthly meeting for congregations that either have or are interested. So we've formed a learning community so they can be learning from each other how they moved it to congregational vote. But that's the easy part, getting it voted on. Learning how to live it is harder. And part of it is because we think we're already there. And so being able to have the humility to take a look and acknowledge that there are other ways of doing things that can be more inclusive and have us really more greater aligned with our UU values, that's what we're asking people to do. I am told, and I don't know with all the changes that are taking place for us right now, but I'm told that we took the principle, the eighth principle, to a vote in 2017, but we were asking for a commission to be formed to consider it as one of our principles. And so I know the board has been looking at that, and I was told that it will come to a vote this year, and next year it has to happen twice. I don't know what that process is going to be right now, but I just want you all to know. So it would be great if your congregation started to look at that too, and if you tapped into this learning community that's growing. So I want to share that with you.
Maybe somebody could put a link to that in the chat if we've got information about that.
Well, I may have to send it to you, and
Okay.
I can't multitask right now.
Well, that's my problem too. I'm recording this so we can share it with others, and that means I can't get out of what I'm doing.
Right. Joe, someone's hand was up.
Yeah,
Karen
who else? We
Kaufman.
got Karen Kaufman. Karen, why don't you want to join in and say something?
Answered, I think,
You're on mute.
most of my
She's unmuted
question.
now.
Can you hear me okay? I'm getting a little echo.
Go ahead.
Yes.
I was just curious about the process of formal adoption of the eighth principle. So I take it it'll be taken up at this year's GA, and which I'm hoping to attend. I hope it still happens. And there will be a formal vote by the whole association, or
Yeah, so I can't promise anything. I don't know for sure because I'm not, the board makes those decisions. I do want to encourage you to look at it at your church.
Yeah,
and
that's a good
you
idea.
can have some models
do
that
that.
other churches have used on how they, proposed the resolution and how they got there. We do have some examples of that. For the board, I wish I knew. I wish I could tell you, but that's also why we're doing grassroots. Because the more churches that adopt it, the easier it will be at the national level too. And by the way, you'll hear, it always comes up about the language being so different than the principles, right? So the language in the eighth principle is very deliberately chosen so that people wouldn't lose the essence. But if it, when it reaches the national adoption, the final language will change, but we're not going to be the ones who are authoring it. So don't let people get hung up on the language. And if they get hung up on the language and can't pass it because of that, then the chances of them being able to live it are slim too. So thank you, Karen.
How are we doing out there? Any other comments or questions?
Renee and DJ have had a hand up.
Oh, okay. Wendy, Wendy, go ahead.
Renee and DJ. Yeah.
Okay, go ahead.
Hi. One of the questions I have, and I think it's largely represented in the fact that all of us who have kind of stayed on the call tend to be probably 45, 50 and older. And not only, you know, what I'm seeing is a disparity in many of our regional congregations, but in a lot of congregations that I visited outside the area is less of a voice than I'd personally like to see of younger generations, younger folks, both white and people of color. And so I feel like if there is a way that you have successfully in your congregations that you participated in, been able to draw out the voices of younger participants, I'd love to hear more on that.
Yeah, so that's where the community of communities really is a benefit. Usually when I do this, I try to have a young adult community or youth community because they do have a perspective on the church that may be slightly different from the older people. Again, location, right? So to have a community and to have their voices equally heard. I was working with one church that was having some challenges following that work around the gadfly last year. Remember that? And so there were over 120 people together. It's like, oh no, how are we going to make this work? But it actually worked. And one of the groups was of youth. And I'm going to tell you, they're already there on this. This is normal culture for them. We're the ones who are slow. But not only were they there, we had these different groups work and you know and take some notes so they could report back to the whole community. The young people, they'd took the notes on their phone. All they had to do was press the button to send them forward. They're ahead of us on this, but they don't hold the authority in the church. And that's why we need the community of communities so that their voices are lifted up and equal with the rest of the voices. Now, in terms of, in terms of young people, oh, by the way, I have a team at my church, the 8th Principal team, and, you know, we have age diversity, but more young people. That's the sweet spot for organizing change. So anybody who is not integrating the young adults and youth into their work, they're really missing some real power. But we came up with, we piloted last year a youth anti-racism training. The first one is for elementary school students, 2nd to 6th grade. And again, they're ahead of us, and the ones who took the training are different from their peers now. Just so much more conscious and aware. A middle school anti-racism training has just been piloted. It's only been tested once, and of course we're going to be working on one for youth for high school. But we need to equip our children for the world that they're going to live in, and so we're working at that. But in terms of your church and where you are now, just go ahead and try a community of communities and make sure that you have a community for the youth and young adults, either separate or together, depending on how many there are. When we do the community of communities work, when groups are brought into conversation together, those conversations, I think, tend to be more authentic and deeper around the issues, because people are not like being so careful about how they do. And think about, you know, sometimes when we have groups, and let's say in terms of people of color, we'll kind of disperse them among groups, right? One here, in each of these different groups. Well, then their voices kind of get watered down. But if people of color are in their own group, Again, it's a different conversation. It's a deeper conversation. And the other groups then don't have to be as careful about what they're saying either. And when they come together, people are not speaking for themselves, but they're reporting back from the group, and it shifts. Every single time I've watched young adults and people of color, every single time I've watched them shift the dominant culture in the room, the dominant conversation. So if you really want to entertain change, give the different voices equal power in the conversation and see what happens.
Mm-hmm.
Thanks.
Help me if other hands are raised that I'm missing.
Yeah.
Oh, there's
I
Anne
see
Marie.
Anne.
Anne Marie, you ready to jump in?
I'd like to add about the young people. I live with 2 young people in my household, and they have a lot to say, and they have a lot of thoughts on it. Like Paula said, they're way ahead of us. And I think they share freely in their own groups. So I think it's great for them to each have a representative who shares with us as a congregation, because when they have a chance to say something in our congregation, whether it's joys or sorrows or some other opportunity to speak, and they don't speak and I ask them why, they don't think that it's their turn because they're not an adult. And so I think it's very important to engage their ideas so that they feel that they're important and that their voice is equal and that we consider it equally. And my other thought, Paula, you had asked what we took away from the service. And you told us about the Maasai greeting, how are the children? And so this makes me very sad and emotional because I live in the city of Troy, and the children are not fine. And the biggest and most immediate problem, which preceded coronavirus, is that they don't have access to education. And if we look at those that are in the lowest and middle income households, I have a daughter who's looking at colleges, and so she's exploring outside of the United States where college is free. And I'm a violin teacher, so my students, even with the Excelsior program in New York State where tuition is free, they don't have money for books. They don't have money for the transportation to take the bus that gets them to the community college. Or the most horrific thing that I found out is that the bus transportation system, the closest bus stop to the public housing is 2 miles away, and there's no sidewalk. And so there's not access to education. And in addition, at the YWCA in Troy, it's the home to between 20 and 30 children, along with their mothers. And so the children are worried about where they're going to get their food because school is closed. And even though the schools are serving food, not all the parents have transportation to get to the pickup. And so the children are not fine. And it's not an appeal about my children. My children have food and shelter. My children live in a household where we both graduated from college. But the children that I see in my community, on my street, and in my neighborhood do not have access to education, and it disturbs me deeply.
And they don't have a voice, right? Those voices have to come through the adult. So that's our work. So when we talk about beloved community, if their needs are not being met, then how can we claim beloved community, right? And also, all of those things that you mentioned, Anne-Marie, are structural and policy issues. Those are all very clear decisions that get made about who gets advantages and who does not. Yeah.
All right. Well, I think we're getting close to our time. We were
I
originally.
see Peg and John have a hand up.
Okay, go ahead. Peg and John.
Okay.
Yeah.
Within the congregation, there are people who are more contemplative and people who are more action-oriented. And a lot of the action-oriented people are volunteering in non-church activities around town without the knowledge or blessing of the congregation. And one of the issues is that I believe in the structure that we have now, the work teams are set up by basically appointment by the ministers or by the board. And I thought I heard it suggested that the communities could actually have a voice on the board. We used to have the silos of councils, and there was a social action council, and we had a representative go as a liaison to the board. But the board never had given us clear directions as to what we were supposed to do. Well, that was one organizational thing that's been corrected, because the teams have a clear mission now, even if they don't have a elected body and they don't have a duration of services until the job is done. So there's that within the church. Going outside the church, I was volunteering at Vale Cemetery, and there were students from Union College who were given credits for being volunteers in the community garden. There were students from the baccalaureate program who were the brightest and great local students, weren't going to move away. They have families here. But this was nothing to do with the Unitarian Church. And my work was not even known about by the church. And none of those students had any notion that my Unitarianism was part of my volunteering, so that they were not pulled into the church. These are people whose lives are changing very rapidly anyway. But there's this great resource of volunteers among the congregation who are not they're not answerable or are part of the covenant of the church. They're just people of goodwill. And so how can we tap into these resources?
That's a good question. It'll be a riddle for you to solve. One of the ways that people would learn about Unitarian Universalism is not necessarily that you're there with your UU hat on, but the conversations that you have with people. And you know, in some of the stories that I've gotten back over the years, it's like, you know, well, someone asked them. They're not necessarily sitting at the housing board table representing the church, but then people discover that that's the church that they go to. And I think that happens through your personal sharing. So that's one way that it happens. The other is you could always have a meeting at the church or a gathering, a community of people who volunteer in the wider community, and start to learn more about the work that each of you is doing. I think each church has to figure out how it approaches the individual who's out there doing the social justice versus kind of the church itself doing social justice. And I think a lot of churches have individuals that are even out there, you know, like they're representing the church. And I'm not saying that this is bad, but then they're only doing it by themselves. They don't have more people from the church working with them, or they're not necessarily reporting back to the church. So it's kind of like a loose social justice program as opposed to a coordinated, organized one in the church. So all of these things take time, and it depends on you know, the size of the church. Sometimes the smaller churches have fewer people, and so you might have a looser structure in some places. It also depends on the the experience and the skills of some of the leaders, including ministers and other lay leaders. So it varies. I think all of this is, again, about our growth and evolution. But you can always invite people into a gathering when they come together. If they're the volunteers out in the community, they become a community when they come to that gathering and talk with each other and share. And, you know, it's kind of like, so how does your volunteer work in the community? How does the church impact the way that you show up in the community and vice versa? It's just a good, healthy conversation to have. A starting point. You know, I've also learned in all these years of doing group work to trust the group. The answers are almost always in the group. If you can bring people together and figure out the right questions, the answers are almost always there. And if not, we can learn together. When we agree to do something, most of what we agree to, we can actually pull off, but you've got to bring people into a conversation.
Well, this brings us to 2 o'clock when we've promised that we would let Paula have a break here. It's been a long day for her. I think it's been a long day for all of us. And we really so much appreciated your willingness to stay with us, share with us the vision that you've got in. I want to make sure you have a chance to share any last words before we close.
Last words. Well, it's been great. It's interesting that my car has become a studio today, and my telephone has become my technology, but, you know, we're still equipped to do that. So I appreciate that. And all the work that has gone into this. Sam, I know you did a ton of work. Leah, it's been great planning with you and working with you and all of the other people who are a part of this. So, you know, you're welcome. I would have been there with you in person, but, you know, there were other plans, and but it didn't stop us from coming together. And it's been good. You know, I hope that we've planted some seeds here today, and that you all will I'm going to shift metaphors, but take the ball and run. Anyway, thanks. And Sam knows how to reach me. I'm a phone call away, and you know, we can. I'm thinking about doing the Eighth Principle Learning Community, setting up a Facebook page so there can be more dynamic exchange between people. But I can keep Sam and Leah posted, and they'll let you all know. So thanks for the invitation.
Thanks for coming so much.
You're welcome.
And yes, we're all doing our. There's a reaction thing down here where you can applaud. So I'm putting up my applause little icon there.
You're
Okay.
welcome.
Thank you all. I'm gonna close out the meeting, and happy trails, and thank you for everything, Paula, and thank you all for joining us and allowing us to continue to be engaged.
All right. Take care, everyone. Take good care of yourselves and each other.
You too, Paula. Thank you.
Be safe.
Bye. Thank you.